Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week is another in the series of Wallsend Tales from the Past, and this is video number 13, so I hope that it's not unlucky 13. As usual, the stories will all be from different years in no particular order, and some stories may be longer than others. I hope you will enjoy it and find it interesting. In 1887, a letter was written to the Newcastle Weekly Chronicle from a young girl by the name of Hilda Middlemast. I actually think that she was possibly the daughter of William Middlemast, who once had a shop on Wallsend High Street, and in 1887 Hilda lived with her family on the Green. She had recently joined what was known as the Dicky Bird Society, though apparently some of the children in those days actually just reduced that to its initials and called it the DBS, which was set up by the Chronicle in 1886 and was headed by someone who was known as Uncle Toby. Children were invited to join the club and promised to be kind to all living things, but mostly birds. Girls and boys had to promise to feed the little birds and teach their friends to be kind to them too, and boys also had to promise never to take any birds' nests or eggs. Hilda, writing from her house on the Green, said she had noticed that not many people from Wallsend had joined the club, so she was going to tell all her friends about it. She also said that they had lots of birds nesting in the ivy outside of their house, and a tame seagull that she had named Billy. She said Billy would eat almost anything, so that's a bit like the seagulls today. The paper made a big thing about her letter, saying they hoped she would recruit lots of people for the Dicky Bird Club. Sadly, there was no follow-up, so I don't know how many of Hilda's friends did end up as club members. And I don't remember anything like that from when I was a kid, but my nana always fed the birds and she encouraged me to do the same. And I also remember walking down Crow Bank when I was little on our regular dog walks and seeing a blackbird's nest in the wall. Sadly, I never did find out if the eggs hatched out, but I did look at it every day when I walked past, fascinated at how clever the bird was to make such a fancy nest. In 1922, 3 young boys, Thomas, Patrick and James, were fined 10 shillings each for stealing apples from a garden belonging to William Richardson in Rose Hill. William Richardson had caught one of the boys and found that he had 35 apples in his pocket. I can't imagine how big his pockets must have been to fit that many in. And he also found a bag that he had dropped which contained another 30 apples. I do hope that the 3 boys had planned to give these apples to someone to make apple pies or something like that, because if all 3 boys had stolen the same amount, they would have been a little bit ill if they'd eaten them all at once. And I also wondered if the man whose garden they stole the apples from was the same William Richardson who wrote the book The History of the Parish of Wallsend. And I think it quite possibly was, as his house did have at the time quite a large garden. This next story is about a man who lived on the Green in Wallsend, and when I first read part of it I knew I had to do a bit of searching to find the full story, as I needed to know what happened. It is quite a long story, but I hope you will find it as interesting as I did. And obviously this is a shortened version of the full story because that was even longer. So, a man who I will just call Sydney lived in East Villa on the Green with his wife and 6 children. I am sure to his neighbours he was just a regular man who went to work each day and took care of his family. But in 1891... he was charged with having stolen around £4,000 from the Pontoon and Dry Dock Company who he worked for. The money had been stolen over a period of time, around 12 months, in small sums, but I'm sure that it came as a shock to everyone who knew him. Now, Sydney wasn't totally daft, After realising he was likely to be caught and that he had got himself into a right mess that he could not get out of, owing too much money to ever be able to pay back, he decided the best thing to do was to leave Wallsend and head off to America. So he left his wife and children behind and off he went. However, once he was there, he wrote a letter to the company explaining what he had done, which was probably not one of his better ideas. And while he did say in his letter that he was very sorry that he had only stolen the money because he had been very much in debt and unable to pay, it's probably worth mentioning that Sidney had not come from a poor family. His father had been a bank manager, and I somehow suspect, once married with children himself, he had at times been living well above his means in a big house with servants, etc., and things had possibly got out of control. However, in his letter to the company, he also said that although he was sorry, he was hoping that they would let him off and allow him to start a new life. And I do think that he was just fooling himself a little bit there. He explained that in a few years' time his children would be grown up and be able to support themselves and their mother, and that when that time came he might come back to Wallsend and pay the penalty for his crime, unless, of course, he was arrested before that. Well, as you can imagine, the company did not plan to let him off, and Inspector Stoker of Wallsend Police Force was soon off to America in search of Sidney, who he was luckily able to find, and he was arrested in Detroit. He was soon back in the UK, first arriving in London and then being transported back to Newcastle to face his trial. He did plead guilty to all of the charges, and each charge was for the separate amount of money that he had stolen at different times. And luckily for him, because he paid some of the money back and was very sorry for his crime, the judge, when Sidney was found guilty, sentenced him to 12 months in prison with hard labour, which, considering the amount he had stolen, which would have been around £650,000 in today's money, was quite a light sentence. I have to admit that I felt sorry for his wife and children. He left them at a time when most of them were under the age of 10, the youngest child being only 3 years old, and they also, as said earlier, had servants at their home on the Green, who most probably lost their jobs, as his poor wife was probably not able to pay them after her husband had left, as she didn't have any money of her own. But his wife must have loved him and been very forgiving, as by 1901 Sidney was back with his family and living in Middlesex, though I must say that at this point both he and his wife had changed their Christian names, Sidney calling himself Charles and his wife going by the name of Ethel. But by 1911 the family were to be found in London, again using their real names, and Sidney died in 1926 at the age of 78. When talking about the past in Wallsend, I often find that a lot of people think things were much nicer and quieter in the past, but this wasn't always the case. In 1904, Mr. Murray said it was time that the council met with the owners of the Green to arrange for the corporation to take over and maintain the area. He said these days it was a terrible place to visit. Many youths gathered there and their language was disgusting, and it simply wasn't a safe place for women to be in after dark. Several people on the council agreed with him, some even saying something must be done soon before the Green was destroyed forever. However, the mayor at the time, Alderman Allen, said he would like to remind everyone that the people of Wallsend had a right to use the Green in whatever way they wanted to, and this may not always mean that the area was quiet and peaceful. In the end, they could not totally agree on what should be done, and it was decided that the question of looking after the Green would be referred back to the Park Committee. Sadly, and I did look, I wasn't able to find out what was done to resolve the issues, but it does seem that the Green was eventually saved from the so-called swearing youths, and it's still a quiet and peaceful place today and a lovely area of Wallsend to live in. The final story this week is another one about Sir J.B. Hunter. This one dates from 1902, just prior to him being Mayor of Wallsend. The papers wrote a short article about him stating that they believed he would soon be the next Mayor of Wallsend, and they couldn't think of anyone better for the job. Mr. Hunter was described as a kindly man, always ready to lend a helping hand to those in need, and there was no one more popular than Mr. Hunter. His family too were held in high regard in the area, and the paper said that Wallsend was very lucky to have them living in their town. Now, I'm pretty sure that I have said this before, but Mr. Hunter played a massive part in Wallsend's past. If he was not building things like the Wallsend Cafe, he was donating money and land to build things like St. Luke's Church, and of course he employed a lot of people in his shipyards. And he also gave the land to Wallsend that most of us know these days as the Burn, and of course he also handed Wallsend Hall over to the people of Wallsend after buying it with no intention to live in it. I think it is often forgotten that without Mr. Hunter, Wallsend would probably have remained a very small village and not grown to be the town we know and love today, and I think he does deserve a lot more recognition than he actually receives. I do hope that you have found this week's short little stories interesting, and I do hope that you have also enjoyed them. I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.